Though you are free to listen to this podcast in any way that is available to you, a good pair of headphones and a dark room are recommended. Welcome back to, I guess I ended up naming these Strange Encounters. That was a name I came up with at the very last second, after I'd recorded the first episode. For the most part, in my Google Docs, these two podcasts were simply called Mom's Spooky Stories. I decided it wasn't very attention-grabbing. Let's start things out with a quick recap of what this is. These two podcasts have served as a way for me to preserve the memory of the stories my mom told me while I was growing up. Stories of, let's say, unconventional things that happened to her over the years. I'd always wanted to get her directly on the record talking about these incidents, but I just never had the nerve to get her in front of the microphone. To be honest, I figured she'd probably refuse, and I was too afraid to try. Then, after years of me waffling on asking to get her on the record, she died from cancer and the window closed for good. Thus, it falls on me to keep this stuff alive, which is unfortunate because I consider myself to be something of an unreliable narrator. Not on purpose, of course, but simply by the fact that my memory isn't always the greatest thing on Earth, and in a lot of cases, it's been at least a decade since the last time she told me all of this stuff fresh. Ergo, I'm going to be embellishing some of these stories simply because I have to fill in the blanks for myself. But I am always telling you these things in good faith, and they are always coming from a place I believe to be the truth. Though that's something I think we'll get into a bit more in this episode. If you missed the previous episode, I won't repeat myself too much about my mother's character. You can always go back and listen to the very long intro of the previous podcast for deeper context. But to sum it up quickly, I believed my mom to be a woman who was honest to a fault. She was honest even when the truth ended up hurting her more than anyone else. She was not a woman who liked to play tricks or pranks, nor was she ever seeking fame and fortune. She almost never drank alcohol and often refused to take even the most basic, harmless, everyday medication. She was not drunk, she was not hallucinating, she was not greedy, and I believe she did not have it in her to lie to me about these things. My mom was a saint in many regards, although a very stubborn one. The previous episode dealt with both my mother's and even my own encounters with unidentified flying objects, mostly hers. Though I hesitate to say that aliens were involved in those incidents, I feel like alien life is pretty easy to believe in. Even though there are plenty of hucksters and crackpots out there making up fake UFO footage, unidentified aircraft are a real thing in our skies, and the universe we live in is so incomprehensibly large that it's statistically likely there are aliens living on other planets out there somewhere. Heck, we've even had unidentified radio signals coming from specific locations in space. Look up something called the WOW signal for more information on that. So I think aliens are kind of easy to believe in. UFOs seem even easier to believe in. It doesn't even have to be from space. There's just unknown stuff in the sky right here, right now, whether it's military test aircraft or otherwise. But what's less easy to believe in are ghosts. You know, the idea that spirits passed on from this world can return to haunt the living. The legendary magician Harry Houdini once made a pact with his wife that upon his death he would do everything in his power to contact her from beyond the grave using a secret code word they shared. And after he died, Houdini's wife never reported any contact with her dead husband. When you consider that many more than Harry Houdini have made similar promises that were never fulfilled, it seems pretty open and shut, doesn't it? But sort of like with UFOs, there are times where it does seem like something unexplained is going on here. Whether that's ghosts or something else we don't understand yet is currently up to interpretation. And my mom had more than a few ghost stories to tell. But before we get to that, I want to establish some more ground rules, just like we did in the last podcast. Mainly, I'd like to share an anecdote that involves both her and me that may make or break how you view the two of us. When I was younger, my mom and I used to watch a lot of movies and TV together. At least once a week, maybe more, we'd have a movie night, and in the days before everybody was streaming everything, there was a block of entertainment called primetime television that happened every night. It usually started around dinner time, and it was meant to be a spread of a few hours where everybody was gathered around the TV together to watch whatever was on that night. Sitcoms like Cheers, Friends, or dramas like ER or The X-Files. And though she didn't really like it, sometimes I could beg and I'd get to watch The Simpsons. Obviously, as I got older, I developed my own interests. Dinner stopped being TV time as I spent more time talking with my own friends, either on the phone or on the computer. Our tastes changed as well. My mom got big into the reality TV boom with shows like Survivor, The Great Race, and Project Runway, all of which were things that I could not stand to watch. Eventually, I realized that there were only really two shows that we sat down and still watched together. The first one being Lost, a show about survivors of a crashed airliner that becomes stranded on a mysterious island. The show started strong, but later seasons became hit or miss when the creators couldn't decide on what their mystery was about. But overall, we enjoyed it. The second one was the only reality show I allowed myself to become invested in. Sci-Fi Channel's Ghost Hunters. Don't laugh. When the show premiered in 2004, the world was an extremely different place. The Ghost Hunters, that is, the Atlantic Paranormal Society, abbreviated to TAPS or TAPS, seemed different from most people who were hawking ghost stories. Coming out of the 80s and into the 90s, paranormal content was all centered around TV psychics like Sylvia Browne or Peter James, celebrities that would go into haunted locations and listen to what the spirits were telling them, which basically means that they would make something up and use that as a launch pad to sell books or seminars or whatever. I don't say this lightly. Most of the psychic techniques used by these celebrities stemmed from something known as cold reading. It's the same technique employed by Sherlock Holmes that allowed him to deduce facts about total strangers. It's a method of asking the right questions to get people to reveal extra information about themselves by accident. The cold reading techniques used by pop culture psychics were never any different. These so-called professional psychics were making bank on what was effectively just an old, well-worn parlor trick, and a lot of people fell for it. Taps seemed different. These guys were tradesmen. They worked as plumbers by day and were ghost hunters as a side gig. They seemed like regular guys who weren't into all of the mystical psychic junk that dominated so much of the previous 2 decades. They were practical, they were scientific, they were even skeptical. A lot of early episodes of Ghost Hunters were them investigating a location and finding absolutely nothing. They had dedicated segments where they would try to debunk claims of paranormal phenomenon. They would try to find average, everyday explanations for weird sounds or strange shadows in the night. More than a few times, my mom even called them the Ghostbusters, not because she was referencing the Ghostbusters movie franchise, but because the Ghost Hunters more often reminded her of the Mythbusters TV show. They tried to bust ghost myths almost as much as they hunted for evidence of their existence. Unfortunately, this was reality TV. No matter how much a show tried to put forth that you were watching unscripted actors in real situations, there was always the guiding hand of a production crew. And in the case of Ghost Hunters, no matter how much they maintained that these two guys were small-time working Joes that did paranormal investigations on the side, it was clear that they had become celebrities, and on top of that, there was a noticeable escalation that happened in the quality of evidence they would capture. Every season had to be more impressive and crazier than the last. Or at least up to a point anyway, but we'll get to that. Point is, if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that early seasons were them trying to be realistic and take it seriously, eventually the quality and the shocking nature of the evidence they captured can only be stretched so far before it's really clear that you're fluffing things up a little, if not outright making it up wholesale. It got especially bad during their Halloween specials, where they'd live stream a ghost hunting investigation in real time all night long. I think of it sort of like that scene in the first Jurassic Park movie, where they're being given a tour and they aren't seeing any dinosaurs. 2 no-shows and 1 sick triceratops. Sometimes the animals just don't want to perform. Under the potential that ghosts were real, you'd expect a similar deal, wouldn't you? There are going to be long stretches of nothing happening, where the performers just aren't performing. That would be natural. But if you're putting on a live TV special about ghosts on Halloween, people are tuning in to see ghosts. You can't give them nothing. So these live specials were dominated by things constantly happening in orders of magnitude more than the regular pre-taped episodes of Ghost Hunters. There were always scary sounds or things moving on their own, and sometimes people on set would even be physically touched by a ghostly presence, with dubious on-camera evidence to back it up. It was simply too good to be true. And it cast a long shadow over the entire show because it got you to stop and ask yourself, how much are they faking? And if they're faking this Halloween special, are they faking anything else? And then there's the simple fact that as the years wore on, they never seemed to reach a point of having enough proof. You would think, as the show entered its 5th year, 6th year, 7th year, that they would have enough evidence to close the book and turn ghosts from myth into science. But that tipping point never came. It was only ever a TV show, and over time, episodes shifted from feeling dynamic and exciting to just following the same slow, predictable routine. As Ghost Hunters fever began sweeping through cable television, we were rapidly losing faith. Part of that was due to us also just picking up other similar shows like UFO Hunters, which followed a group of conspiracy theorists listening to testimony about alien encounters. We also watched Destination Truth, a show where a team of thrill seekers traveled the globe looking for real evidence behind ancient cultural legends. Of the two, Destination Truth was definitely the most entertaining, thanks to its host, Josh Gates. His personality landed somewhere between Indiana Jones and a game show host. He was energetic, funny, and had a genuinely charming sense of adventure. It was easy to get swept up in his wacky antics every week. All 3 shows eventually wore out their welcome. There's a limit to how much you can tolerate people pretending to be excited about crackling audio and blurry footage. Ghost Hunters became something we only watched to make fun of. We'd heckle the obviously manufactured fake drama or share confusion when the investigators would call out evidence that didn't actually exist. Which, as the program began to show its age, became a shockingly frequent occurrence. As the original cast members began to quit the show and cycle in a greater volume of newbies, Ghost Hunters developed a tendency for people to talk about hearing footsteps that were somehow never audible in the recording. No matter how high we cranked up our TV's volume, no matter how much we strained our ears, none of these ghostly footsteps could ever be heard. It eventually became the first TV show I consistently fell asleep during. As the show got more and more predictable, I'd be out like a light within 15 minutes. I'd usually wake up right before the show was over, just in time for them to present their findings, and it never seemed like I missed very much. I think I would have just stopped watching the show altogether, but I realized it was the last dying gasp of that family TV night tradition that started when I was a little kid. I didn't want to let go of that quality time, and I don't think my mom did either. So we toughed it out, no matter how bored we were of the show itself. When Ghost Hunters ended, she moved on to the next wave of reality TV, competitions. Baking competitions, fashion competitions, and home repair competitions. All of that became her bread and butter. I just went back to using that time to hang out with my friends more. I tell this story, one, because it's a bittersweet memory of an era coming to an end with my now deceased mother. And two, to establish that while we were open to certain possibilities, we had limits for what we were willing to believe. And when it comes to the stories that she told me, there are some where I'm not entirely willing to believe them for myself. In particular is this podcast's first story. And I hesitate to even really call it a story, it's kind of more of an anecdote. As teenagers, my mom and her two sisters were apparently sitting around one night messing with a Ouija board. You know, as teenagers sometimes do. If, for whatever reason, you don't know what a Ouija board is, it's sometimes known as a spirit board. It's not something you can really play by yourself. You need a minimum of at least 2 people, and it's meant for groups of 4 people or more. Participants place their fingers on a device called a planchette, which is usually a triangle with a little hole cut out in the middle. The planchette is then placed on a board containing letters, numbers, and some basic phrases like yes or no. There's usually some kind of ritual to open a portal to the spirit realm, and you ask the spirits questions. The planchette then moves around the board, seemingly guided by ghostly energy, and it spells out words or points towards symbols. Often, people ask for specific spirits by name, like dead relatives or celebrities, but sometimes the spirits will provide their own names when asked. And part of the mystery and entertainment comes from not knowing whether the answers are real or whether the information you're getting is true. It's supposed to be a little unsettling and unknowable. But, you know, the Ouija board is a brand owned and sold by Hasbro, the toy company that also currently owns Barbie and Mr. Potato Head. Okay, so back to my mom and her sisters. They had spent a few hours asking the Ouija board a variety of different questions. You know, the usual stuff, trying to get names, trying to figure out who they were speaking to, how they died, and so on. But one of her sisters suddenly got an idea for a really great question. Why bother getting information from all these regular, everyday ghosts? They could go up the ladder, speak to management, find out who's in charge. So they all placed their hands on the planchette, and her sister asked a bombshell of a question. Who is the keeper of the board? According to my mother, what happened next is that the planchette violently shot off the board, directly at her sister's head. Supposedly, it moved with such force and speed that it became embedded in the wall. She narrowly avoided being hit by it. They just sat there in stunned silence, and all 3 of them agreed to never touch the Ouija board ever again. This story was told to me as a warning to never mess with Ouija boards. Now, the time frame for this would have been the mid-1950s or maybe the very early 1960s. Ouija boards back then were made of wood, but the planchettes themselves were still plastic. It seems easier to believe that the planchette would have probably shattered if it really moved with that much force. It was always suggested that the planchette nearly killed one of her sisters. The reality, I think, is that my mom was just religious enough that she probably heard superstition that the board was bad news and made something up just to scare me off. After all, you don't have to go too far to find various warnings about how using Ouija boards will open spiritual doors that are difficult to close. Using a Ouija board even one time could curse you for the rest of your life if you don't properly end the conversation. Of course, all of that danger and mystery is gone now, given that all it takes is a simple internet search to find its origins as a social experiment and a mass-market toy. There is almost certainly no magic in a Ouija board. But my mother's warning still worked. I have never used a Ouija board, and even if I don't believe this story for myself anymore, I still don't think I'd be willing to use one. If the Ouija board is fake, then using one is a waste of time. And on the longest long-shot chance that it's somehow real, well, then maybe it actually is dangerous. Neither outcome sounds very good for me, so generally I just don't care about Ouija boards. Now, her other stories are a little less cut and dry. Without getting into too many details, let's just say that my mom did not have very good luck in marriage. If I remember right, she had no fewer than 3 husbands in her life, all of which she divorced, and there's a litany of reasons behind those divorces that are too personal to tell on this podcast. All you really need to know is that she had a habit of picking men that turned their back on her in one way or another. I believe this story involves her first husband, probably around 15 to 20 years before I was born. That probably puts this around the mid to late 1960s, maybe only a few years after the Ouija board story. It wasn't long after they had been married. They had just moved into their first house together. It was an old farmhouse, maybe somewhere in Colorado, and it was your traditional idea of a farmhouse. A little scrappy, a little scuffed, the kind of place that was visibly made of creaking wood. The house itself was a little cramped, but it had 2 floors and an attic. Enough room to start a family. It was kind of out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by acres of empty land waiting for crops, dotted with thickets of trees. Though they had electricity, I'm pretty sure water had to be pumped up from a well. This is how it was back then. You were buying new, undeveloped land. It was an investment. This was where they were going to spend their lives together. It was the era of the men working and the women tending to the house. So her husband would leave for work in the morning and my mom would often spend the day at home, alone, cleaning and shopping or cooking and just generally taking care of the place. Housewife stuff. They hadn't even been moved in a week when my mom said the strange occurrences started happening. Even though there was nothing wrong before they moved in, she told me that just being in the house began to feel weird. It was like she could never turn on enough lights to brighten the place up. It always felt cold and dark and empty. Sometimes it felt like she was being watched. And the longer they lived there, the worse it became. One day, both my mom and her husband came home from a grocery trip to find that the kitchen faucet had been left running full blast. Obviously, this was confusing, but confusion turned into an argument once it started happening consistently. And soon, it became a regular occurrence. They'd leave the house only to come home to the faucet turned on. Blame started flying. Who was forgetting to turn off the water before they left? They pumped this water up from a well, and wasting it was a dangerous proposition. They even suspected it could be a prankster. Maybe some kid was sneaking into their house while they were gone and turning on the water. It certainly wasn't unheard of. So they started making sure the windows were closed and latched, doors were locked, everything they could do to prevent someone from getting in. None of it mattered. They would still come home to the kitchen faucet wasting water. It didn't make any sense. Were they being taunted? For my mom and her husband, these incidents were getting increasingly frustrating. But then things took a turn for the worse. It was the dead of night, a little before 1 a.m. My mom and her husband were both sound asleep when suddenly the pair were awoken to a strange sound. It was the sound of running water. A faucet had been turned on. And this time, it wasn't from the kitchen. No, now it was coming from the master bathroom, which was only accessible from the main bedroom. For someone to turn this faucet on, they would have needed to find a way into the house, go up the stairs, down the hall, through the bedroom, and then turn on the water. All without being detected or making a sound. The thought was more than a little unnerving. And it wasn't even the strangest thing that happened at that farmhouse. In between incidents where the water in the house was being turned on at random, my mother was simultaneously dealing with a different problem. On some nights, her husband would simply go missing. According to my mom, there were multiple times where he would accidentally wake her up while getting out of bed, usually between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. He would then exit their bedroom, head down the stairs, and leave the house. He was still in his pajamas and completely barefoot. He'd walk out into the grass and just keep going until he disappeared into the trees. She thought that maybe he was going outside to pee, except that when he'd leave in the middle of the night like this, he'd often be gone for hours at a time. Then, usually an hour or two before dawn, he'd come back inside, shivering cold and with muddy feet, climb back into bed and go to sleep, only to then immediately wake back up a few minutes later and go to work. When asked about what he was doing outside late at night, he claimed to have no memory of ever getting out of bed at all. He had no history of sleepwalking either. It was like he was being lured out of the house in a trance. And it happened night after night after night. Her husband continued to act odd even when he was awake. He seemed afraid to be in the house by himself. He'd often find excuses to go out with friends or work late or whatever else, just as long as it meant avoiding being in the house alone. My mom didn't necessarily want to be there either. Obviously, just being in the house already had this generally uneasy vibe, but there was one particular night where she said it suddenly came to a peak. She said it felt like somebody had screamed to "Get out!" And she was overcome with this feeling that someone or something wanted her to leave. With no hesitation, she dropped everything and ran for the door, feeling like she was in great danger. By the time she made it out into the driveway, the feeling began to fade. Nothing had happened. She didn't actually hear any sounds or voices. It was just this sudden, powerful, overwhelming feeling that she needed to escape. She told me it was like nothing she'd ever felt before, and she'd never felt anything like it since. She spent the rest of the evening sitting on their front porch, waiting for her husband to get home. Being in the house strained their marriage. My mom has even told me that she blames some of this particular divorce on what was going on at this strange old farmhouse. She was never sure if he was cheating on her or if he really was just afraid to come home at night. Whatever the case was, he wasn't giving her any answers, and they didn't stay married very long. I'm not sure what to make of this story, and I never have been. There are so many different angles to look at it from. Like, let's take the urge to suddenly go running out of the house. I personally have grown up with a history of anxiety problems that have at times led to inexplicable panic attacks. And yeah, if her marriage was starting to get bumpy, her husband was always working late, if he was leaving in the middle of the night to go do who knows what out in the cold wilderness, and she was all by herself in that old house, I could definitely see a situation where she could have had a panic attack and just wanted to run away. But it's the other stuff that goes along with it. The fact that her husband might have also been afraid of the house. The fact that they would come home to these sink faucets turned on full blast, sometimes even while they were sleeping. You could claim it was neighborhood kids playing a prank, but what neighborhood kids? Again, this was out in the middle of nowhere. It was just dirt, grass, and trees around them in all directions. And what, were those same kids breaking into their house in the dead of night and doing this while they were sleeping? I mean, sure, it's not impossible, but it would take a very special kind of psychopath. And that in itself is unsettling for completely different reasons. It's just a weird story, I guess, and trust me, the stories only get weirder from here. For our next story, we fast forward a long time, to the point where I was now born and brought into this world. We were living in California by this point, in a crummy little apartment complex, I think maybe in El Cajon. I was too young to really remember much about this, but to my mom, it made her skin crawl. The apartments we were in were at least 2 floors, and we were on the bottom floor. That meant that we had neighbors that lived above us. And such is the case with upstairs neighbors, when they would move across their apartment, you could hear their footsteps as floorboards creaked. The floors were thin enough you could even hear people having faint conversations if you really listened closely. Until one day the footsteps just stopped. In their place, the sound of boxes being dragged across the floor. Boxes or furniture or something. It was big and heavy, and it would slide from one side of the apartment to the other and back again, over and over and over. This went on for weeks. My mom had never met the neighbors above us, so she didn't really know what they were doing, but it seemed strange to her that she never heard footsteps anymore. Just the sound of objects sliding around, often at all hours of day, even late into the night. After nearly a month, the sound stopped. She figured they were probably packing boxes and had finally moved out. But once the next tenant moved in, the weirdness went up a notch. At first, everything seemed totally normal. She could hear movement up above, but nothing that was cause for alarm. Until she really stopped and paid attention to what the tenant above us was actually doing. She'd get up off the couch and walk into the kitchen to make a sandwich. The person above us would then also get up and then walk into their kitchen. My mom would go back and sit down to watch TV, and whoever was in the apartment above us would also go back to their living room. My mom would get up to go to the bathroom, and the person above us would follow her in there, going into their own bathroom above ours. My mom would flush, and then a second or two later hear the toilet above us also flush. every single thing my mom did, this person would try to match as closely as possible. It didn't stop there. My mom would get a phone call, and almost instantly the phone would also ring in the apartment above ours. Mom said that whoever lived above us sounded like they had a male voice, and the moment she would hang up, he would stop talking. She'd turn our TV up and he'd turn his up to match. She'd hit the mute button and he'd return the favor. Every single thing she'd do, he was always 1 or 2 steps behind her. He even mirrored her bedtime, with her being able to hear his footsteps follow behind hers into the bedroom every night. There was even a time where she had an upset stomach and swore that she could hear the tenant above her fart at the same times she did. Now, that sounds funny, but it was beyond weird, and she was more than happy to get out of there and move somewhere else as soon as our lease was up. And frankly, I don't blame her. I don't know what was going on here. There's a case to be made that maybe she was just hearing some kind of an echo, but that begs the question as to why she never heard it earlier. It also doesn't make any sense that she could hear a male voice coming from the tenant above us. It couldn't have been an echo. But then, who was it? How could they have known exactly where my mom was at all times, and why were they going out of their way to follow her around the apartment? Could it have been a stalker? But again, how would they know where she was? We could hear where he was, but typically you cannot hear the footsteps of the tenant below you. And again, why? It just doesn't make any sense, but it is deeply creepy. But let's get even weirder. We skip ahead once again, 10 years or so. By now, my mom and I had moved back to Colorado, to the sleepy suburb of Lafayette, nestled at the edge of the foothills near Boulder and Longmont. I grew up in Lafayette, and all total we were there for a solid 25 years. Pretty impressive stuff considering we were renters. At this point in time, we'd been living there probably somewhere in the realm of 3 to 5 years, and I was on the cusp of becoming a teenager, if I wasn't already. It's hard to pin down, but we'll say this is the late 90s or maybe early 2000s. My mom had been bouncing around various jobs, doing data entry, working as a phone tree operator for a cable company, and now she landed herself as a cashier at a locally owned business known as the Craft Gallery. This was a place where people could make and sell homemade items. It was full of knickknacks, books, crocheted stuffed animals, and hand-sewn clothing. This meant the Craft Gallery, despite being a retail establishment, was converted from an old home. Going inside, you were quite clearly just in somebody's house, making it feel simultaneously cozy and a little cramped. Most of the merchandise was in what was probably the living room, dining room, and probably the kitchen too. There was more space upstairs on the second floor, but that was reserved for the owner's office and varying amounts of product storage. And it wasn't long after my mom started working there that she began to clock strange occurrences. My mom was a smoker, but there was no smoking inside the building, so a couple times a day she'd go outside on break to light up a cigarette for a few minutes. Upon returning to the store, she'd find that somebody had come in and rearranged all of the displays. My mom was very particular about items in the store being set up the way she liked them. It wasn't a big store, so it was easy to rearrange. She'd often put small, cheap stuff up by the register, making for easy impulse purchases. But when she'd come back in from her smoke break, those items near the register would suddenly be someplace else on the opposite side of the room. At first, she thought maybe it was her boss. Her boss also liked to rearrange the store on a whim, and like I said, the space wasn't very big, so redecorating could potentially go pretty quickly. But the thing is, her boss would have to be sneaking into the store undetected to do something like that, And not only would that be weird, there was no indication that's what was going on. My mom never caught her in the act and never saw her or her car anywhere near the store when this would happen. As far as my mom could tell, she was alone, but somebody was moving the merchandise around behind her back. Then, one day, buried in a basket of teddy bears, my mom found a big kitchen knife. The sort of thing you'd use to carve up meat or cut up vegetables. No idea where it came from, no idea who would have left it there or why, but it could have been very dangerous if a little kid had come into the store and started rooting around in the stuffed bears only to find a very sharp surprise. Not long after, in that exact same basket of teddy bears, my mom had found someone had torn the head clean off of one of the bears and simply left it in the basket. She said it looked like someone had twisted it until it ripped. Now, once again, we could blame this on edgy teenagers pulling stupid pranks, but just like with her boss possibly rearranging the store behind my mom's back, nobody was ever caught in the act. These things just seemed to be happening at random. And what couldn't be teenagers is what my mom would hear some nights as she was closing up the store to go home. Once or twice a week, at roughly the same time of night, she could hear somebody flush the upstairs toilet and then open the bathroom door as if they were leaving. Obviously, the first few times this happened, she checked things out for herself and found that nobody was there. She was the only one in the store. That's because as activity escalated, my mom's boss began to make herself scarce. It was like deja vu with her husband all over again. Her boss would refuse to work shifts in the craft gallery alone and began making sure that if she had to go in, my mom was there to back her up. Something definitely had her spooked. Activity wasn't limited to times where people were working the store alone either. Once, my mom and her boss came into the store to find it filled with the smell of rotting meat. They spent most of the day trying to track down where the smell was coming from. The smell got stronger when they went upstairs, but they could never find the source, and when they went back the next day, it was gone. Eventually, my mom decided to work up the courage and ask her boss if she'd encountered anything weird. Her boss had told her about hearing strange sounds upstairs like footsteps, and that she'd also encountered the toilet flushing itself at certain times of night. That confirmed that these weren't isolated incidents localized just to my mom. Somebody else was experiencing the same things. But by far the strangest event happened one day while my mom was on the phone to her sister. It was a small, slow little store. As it turns out, there wasn't a huge market for handmade ceramics, keychains, or sock monkeys. And especially not at the prices they charged. So when things got really slow, and they were often really slow, my mom would use the phone near the register to call up her sister and chat as a way to pass the time. And on this day, it was getting close to closing time, so my mom started counting the drawer for the day's sales. This wasn't my mom's first time working retail, and she knew how she liked to keep her cash drawer organized. Ones on the left, then fives, then tens, and miscellaneous bills towards the right. But as she opened the drawer this time, the order went tens, fives, ones. It was backwards from the way she normally did it. A little weird, but only a little. She counted the earnings, put the money back where she wanted it, and before double-checking her figures, closed the drawer. Now, if you work retail, and especially work the register, you know to always double-check your figures. Triple-check, even. So she pushed the button, opened the drawer back up, and the tens and ones had swapped places a second time. Surely she made a mistake, right? She had forgotten to reorganize the money the way she liked it before closing the drawer, so everything was still reversed. With her sister still on the phone, she audibly called out as she reorganized the register to be ones, fives, and then tens. but something felt off. Having the register be wrong twice in a row like that was kinda strange. Something in her gut told her to open the register one last time, and when she did, she discovered that once again, now for a third time, where the money was located in the drawer had reversed position. And this time she was absolutely sure she had put it in correctly. By this point, my mom was freaking out to her sister over the phone. There was no other explanation than the money was somehow moving by itself when the register was closed. Both of them agreed that she needed to lock up and get out of there as soon as possible. I remember the evening my mom came home telling me about this. She was a total nervous wreck. Her eyes were as wide as saucers, and her hands were shaking. Talking with my aunt about it, she confirmed as much as she could, having been on the other side of the phone line that day. Obviously, it's not legitimately scary. It doesn't seem like she experienced anything violent, but it was deeply strange. I can only imagine that an incident like this really makes you focus on certain questions regarding the nature of human existence and what comes after, Because it really did feel like strong evidence of a place being haunted by something, even if it was ultimately just barely threatening. I don't blame her for being a little shaken. A few weeks after the incident with the register, as my mom was heading out to her car after work, somebody nearby stopped her to make small talk. All the houses around the craft gallery were still regular residential homes, and this was somebody who either lived next door or at least lived on the block somewhere. The first thing he asked her was, "How do you like working at the haunted house?" He was an older gentleman. My mom said at least 50s, probably older. He told her he lived on this street ever since he was a boy, and all the kids called that building the haunted house. Apparently, it was quite common to hear screaming coming from it at one point, and there were rumors that a family that lived there met a violent end many, many years ago. My mom confided in him some of the things that had happened while she worked there, and he simply nodded and told her that he wasn't surprised. For what it's worth, while producing this podcast, I found a newspaper clipping dating as far back as 1982 that pegged this address as a business called Kid Stuff that specifically dealt in making handcrafted toys. That means it had been a retail space for more than a decade already, but given this man's age, he was likely a baby boomer or even older than that, meaning he might have been born in the 1950s or even the 1930s. If he grew up on this street in the 1950s, it's possible it could have still been a residential building back then. The simple fact is that the craft gallery really wasn't much of a success. Business was sluggish, and whatever was going on inside the building probably made things worse. My mom started getting her hours cut just because things were so slow. Sales eventually did begin to pick back up, but not because of anything my mom or her boss was doing. The boss had hired a third employee, a newbie, who sometimes picked up shifts on my mom's off days. This third employee, another woman, had been going to thrift stores and flea markets, buying up old clothes and then upcycling them. She'd add new trim to skirts, fix holes in pants, and sell them as modern, retro chic fashion. The margins on these clothes were enormous, and soon more than half the craft gallery was made up of her restored fashion. This was bad news for my mom. This new employee seemed to have an agenda, and it involved pushing my mom out and making inroads with the boss. She was trying to take over the store. With her hours cut down to practically nothing, my mom was eventually forced to quit, and within a few months the craft gallery had fully converted over to a totally new store dedicated to this upcycled clothing called Goldie's. Neither my mom's old boss or this other employee were named Goldie, so who knows where that name came from. Within a year or two of taking over the craft gallery, Goldie's quickly outgrew the tiny little residential building and moved to a larger, more traditional retail space a few blocks away. As a sidebar, you may notice I haven't mentioned anyone's names. That's largely because I just don't remember them. I was still kind of a kid at this point, and that was more than 20 years ago. At best, I think my mom's boss might have been called Karen, or possibly Helen, but I honestly don't know, and I remember even less about this third employee's name, given she mainly swooped in at the very end of my mom working the craft gallery. Even the name Goldie's took legitimate research to figure out and remember. Originally, I thought the business was called Sally's, which is why I started digging into newspaper archives. Eventually, something triggered my memory there, and if you do some digging on your own, it's not hard to find an old Yelp profile for Goldie's. After Goldie's left, businesses came and went in that old haunted house. Most didn't last more than 3 years before somebody else would take the space. Acupuncture, a massage parlor, beauty spas, and more. Going back to old newspaper clippings, I'd even found evidence to suggest that businesses came and went in this building pretty rapidly even before my mom worked there. I'd previously mentioned finding an archival newspaper scan from 1982 where a business occupied this building known as Kid Stuff that sold handcrafted toys. I also found a newspaper scan from 1981, just 1 year earlier, that listed this business as a vacuum repair shop. In 1980, it was a barber shop. Businesses had been rotating through that building for a while. Every time we'd drive by it on our way through town, I'd always intently stare at its windows, hoping to see someone or something else looking back at me. Eventually, a bed and breakfast business settled in the building and stuck there. Last I checked, before leaving Colorado, it was still there. Maybe the ghosts are gone now. Or maybe they just like to sleep in a really cozy bed. For those of you expecting things to keep escalating from there, the story you just heard is probably about as weird as things are going to get for us in this podcast. But there are 2 more things I'd like to tell you about. If you listened to the episode on UFO encounters, you know that almost nothing paranormal has ever really happened to me. Whatever made my mother a magnet for these kinds of events didn't really get passed down to me, but I'd also say that I've led a much more sheltered life than she did too. But that's not to say I am completely devoid of my own strange encounters. One of them even happened while I was with my mom. Unfortunately, it's the kind of story that's hard to convey in podcast form, but I'll do my best. We were still living in the town of Lafayette, and near our house was a dry cleaning place. I think when we first moved there, it was called Scientific Dry Cleaning, but in the last few years before we moved, it had changed hands and was now renamed to Art Dry Cleaning. It was the sort of thing where you see it so much you just kind of stop paying attention to it. We live near the edge of town, and anytime we'd go anywhere, we'd pass the dry cleaners and the little antique store beside it. The 2 buildings weren't connected, so there was a little bit of open space between the antique store and the dry cleaners. If I'm remembering correctly, there was a time where the dry cleaner building actually had drive-through service, so there was enough space for a drive-through lane, a parking spot next to it on the left, and another parking spot next to the antique store. So between these 2 buildings was the width of a 3-lane road, basically. Around 150 to 200 feet, let's say. Behind both the dry cleaners and the antique store were a couple more parking spaces and a very tiny alley that separated the retail spaces from the residential homes. My mom and I were driving home one night after a late grocery run when something suddenly caught our attention. Big, bright, high-beam headlights suddenly lit up the west face of the antique store, shining from the dry cleaners. It was so bright that even though my mom was the one driving, she turned her head to look at it. When I say the light coming from the dry cleaners was bright, I think it's difficult to over-exaggerate. It was almost like somebody had turned on a spotlight. And with the way things were positioned, the light would have needed to have been shining from inside the building, pointing outwards, possibly through a window. But the windows on the side of the dry cleaner building are small and irregular. I'm not sure where the light would have been shining from. The only other explanation I have is that it could have been a car, except that the car would have needed to be angled in such a way that it would have been plainly visible to us in that 3-lane space between the dry cleaners and the antique store. But there was absolutely nothing there. This super bright spotlight seemed to have basically come from nowhere. I remember exclaiming out loud, "What was that?" A light that bright at this time of night, meaning I think it was 2 a.m., it seemed suspicious enough by itself, but once I realized that I didn't see anything that could be making that light, it really began to seriously bother me. As we reached the corner to go home, my mom instead made a U-turn and we slowly cruised back by the dry cleaners again, making sure to get a good long look. Both the dry cleaners and the antique store were empty. There were no cars parked anywhere, no lights on in either building. We even whipped around back and scanned the alleyway for taillights. Down every direction we looked, we were the only car on the road as far as the eye could see. Nothing was out there. Neither of us knew what to make of it, and it was something that we both witnessed together. Was it even paranormal? I don't know. It was just a weird bright light, shining seemingly out of an impossible space, and it's something I cannot explain. Again, it's just weird. The last story I'd like to impart on you in this episode is maybe the only time I think something truly, identifiably paranormal has ever happened to me, and it was when I was pretty young. To be fully honest with you, I was so young that for the longest time, I'd kind of forgotten about it. I was maybe 5 years old, 6 at most when this happened. Remembering things from when you were so young often takes on sort of like a dream-like quality, and I would have chalked it up as a dream if it wasn't for my mom, who actually reminded me about it to begin with. If she remembered it, then it definitely must have happened. We were still living in California at this time. I think this might have been when we were living in Hemet before moving to El Cajon. That sets this around the mid to late 1980s. And the notable thing here is that the little apartment we were in had a shared bathroom that connected my room with my mom's. So, every night as I was going to sleep, I could see lights shine in around the cracks of the door as my mom was getting her hair in curlers for work the next day. One night, while she was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, I looked over at my other door, the one that led into the hallway going into the living room. And floating at the top of this door was this shape. That's all I can really describe it as. It wasn't really a figure or an object or a person, but this nebulous swirling orb of smoke about the size of a softball. The best way I've been able to describe it is it's like when you stare at a very bright light source and then go into a dark room. The light you were looking at ends up kind of burned into your vision as this dark, undulating blind spot that changes colors as it slowly fades from your vision. That's exactly what this thing looked like, except with a blind spot, it kind of sticks in your vision. No matter where you look, the blind spot is always there until it goes away, like it's attached to your eyes. This thing in my room that night didn't do that. I could look away to other parts of the room, and it always stayed just above the hallway door. If I closed my eyes, I didn't see it. I didn't even have to close my eyes. I could cover my eyes with my hands and it would be blocked from view. This wasn't eye strain, this wasn't a vision problem. This was a presence in my room, stationed at a specific location, and it just hung there in the air, floating, like an absence of light, like an absence of vision. Once I started to realize that it wasn't a blind spot and it was something actually inside my room, I got out of bed and started to approach it. I wanted to try touching it, but I was too short, so I grabbed the longest thing in my room. Earlier in the week, my brother had bent an old metal clothes hanger so that it was mostly straight, and I'd been playing with it. I think he wrapped a wad of duct tape around the really sharp ends so that I wouldn't cut myself, turning it into just a long metal rod. I had great fun swinging it around like a sword, so now I grabbed that bent hanger and swiped the shape floating above my door. The clothes hanger just passed right through it, like it was air. It didn't swirl the material around either. Whatever this thing was, it remained perfectly still, completely unmoored by my attempts to poke at it. By now, I knew something weird was going on, so I knocked on the bathroom door and decided to ask my mom. Being 6 years old at most, I probably didn't do a very good job describing to her what I was seeing, but I caught enough of her attention that she came into my bedroom to check it out. The moment she reached over and flipped on the light switch, the strange shape vanished. Completely disappeared. I tried to tell her, tried to show her where it was, but I couldn't really convey what was going on, and she failed to understand. I was just some rambling little kid telling her another random story, as little kids tend to do. She probably brushed it off as me having a bad dream, scooted me off back to bed, and left. The moment she reached up and flipped the light off, bam, there it was again, right at the top of the doorframe, like it had never left. Whatever this thing was, it was only visible when the lights were off. I even tested it for myself by getting back out of bed and playing with the light switch. When the lights were on, it couldn't be seen. The lights had to be off. I did my best to call my mom back into the room and explain to her that it only appeared when the lights were off, but she'd already had enough of me. It was almost 2 hours past my bedtime, and she was trying to go to bed for herself. I was wasting her time. Eventually, meeting me in the middle, she simply told me to ignore whatever it was. If I couldn't see it while my eyes were closed, then that meant I should keep them closed and just go back to sleep. Being this powerless little kid, I did as my mom told me and went to sleep. I never saw that shape ever again. After a certain point, I completely forgot about that night in my bedroom. It only happened one time for one night when I was very young. Even if I knew that it was strange then, I don't think anyone would be blamed for the memory to eventually fade. It wouldn't be until nearly 20 years later that my mom was telling stories about my dad. I never really knew my dad because, by all accounts, people tell me he was not a very nice person. And like I said, my mom had many divorces. My dad was one of them, and it sounded to me like she had very good reasons. After my mom had divorced him, she had reason to believe that he had occasionally stalked us. There were incidents where anonymous gifts would show up at the doorstep based on conversations my mom had been having with people on the telephone. The only conclusion she could come up with at the time is that they came from my dad, who was probably spying on us somehow. This fact was more or less corroborated by my brother a few years ago, who actually lived with my father for a brief period after he and my mom separated. We were talking about him in the lead up to my mom's last days, and he confirmed that during a trip where my dad came out to California to visit us, he didn't immediately leave after his time was over. He continued to hang around just out of sight, watching and listening to us. A different kind of ghost. In the context of that strange shape I saw that night, my mom brought it up to me thinking that I was describing a flashlight beam to her. She thought it might have been my dad trying to get my attention from the window, And being this little kid, I wasn't able to explain it very well. Hearing this again as an adult, it unlocked primal memories of that night. There's absolutely no way what I saw that night was a flashlight beam. Like I said, it was much closer to the absence of light. It was like a shadow burned into your retina, a void of no light at all. When I told this to my mom, she became visibly disturbed, even more so than she had been by the idea that it was just my dad stalking us. She demanded we drop the subject immediately. She didn't want to think about it. It freaked her out. Were any of these stories spooky? Were some of them even paranormal? I envision this podcast episode as being full of a bunch of ghost stories, but most of what I've just told you here are strange occurrences. Sure, some of these things could possibly be blamed on weird marriage drama, but what was experienced at the Lafayette Craft Gallery was too strange to ignore. And history suggests it may have been something that happened over a much longer period of time than just what my mom saw. And I have no words for what I saw as a very young boy. I'd be willing to dismiss it as a strange dream, but the fact that it was my mom that helped jog my memory about the event leads me to believe in it more than ever. The strange shape I saw that night couldn't have been a dream. Not if my mom remembers me telling her about it. And I'd had dreams like that when I was a little kid. I have a distinct memory of being at a sleepover when I was in kindergarten with another kid in my class, and I woke up from a dream where I barfed up a full plate of freshly prepared spaghetti on my bed, and I was about to be forced to eat it again. I was so sure the dream was a real thing about to happen to me, but once the kids' parents pointed out that there was no spaghetti in the room, no spaghetti even in their house at all, I came to my senses. That's not what happened here. This was something that not only started before I fell asleep, it happened over a period of 30 minutes to an hour, was corroborated by my mother as something I told her about, and continued happening even after she got involved, even if she never personally witnessed it. That makes me pretty certain that something happened. As for what that something was, on some level, I don't know. Was it a being? Was it sentient? There's no explanation. And it's not even like it was your traditional definition of a ghost. It wasn't a person or an animal or a moment in time. It wasn't even an object, not really. It's very strange. There's just no way to say what it was. The important thing to remember is that it's okay to talk about these things, and it's okay if you don't know what they were. That's one of the other things I want to bring to the forefront, is that it's okay to say that you don't know, because I think admitting that you don't know is braver than trying to make up an answer. And that doesn't mean that I'm anti-science either. But there are a lot of people out there who both claim to have all the answers, but also simply do not actually know anything. It doesn't matter if you're a believer or a skeptic, that's always going to be bad news. That's why I'm saying it's okay to admit that you just don't know what happened. There's lots of unknowns in this world, and I think it's better if we learn to live with that fact than hide from it or pretend that it cannot be true. By our very nature as human beings, we will never know everything, and there shouldn't be any shame in admitting that. This might be the final episode of this podcast series, but as far as things I heard from my mom, this is where we close the book. I have told you everything I remember her telling me. I hope you enjoyed listening to these 2 episodes and that they didn't make you too sad when they touched on family drama. This podcast, or a podcast similar to it, may return someday, but for now, I bid you all goodbye and good night. And remember, always look up. This has been part 2 of a collection of strange encounters, as retold in podcast form by Ryan Bloom. This is most likely the final episode in that series, but if you'd like to be notified about other new podcasts, consider subscribing.
Paid members receive podcasts early, so if you have the means, consider chipping in a couple bucks. You can find more information on how to subscribe at bltn.net. Music used in this podcast includes remixed and transformed versions of songs from Addams Family Values for the Super Nintendo, Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem for the Nintendo GameCube, 40 Winks for the PlayStation, Resident Evil for the GameCube, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver for the PlayStation, Castlevania 4 for the Super Nintendo, and Silent Hill for the PlayStation. Some ambient tones were also recorded from the generative.fm website, an open source project that generates endless ambient music. A number of the sound effects used in this podcast were also sourced from the Free Sound Audio Repository, a collaborative library of royalty-free music and sound effects. You can visit its website at freesound.org. New videos will resume soon. As always, check bltn.net for the latest updates or Ryan's social media. We hope to see you again on the next one, whatever that may be.